Let your thoughts drift like mist over the fields of time. We begin not with a bang, but with a quiet turning of centuries. The world is slower now, softer. It's the 12th century, and night falls gently over a countryside quilted in green and gold. A thin ribbon of chimney smoke curls into a dusky sky. Somewhere, a church bell rings, low and mellow, marking vespers. The sheep are silent. The stars have begun to blink. This was the world of medieval Europe, a place of deep rhythms, where seasons governed more than weather, and even the matters of the heart were planted and harvested in time. To understand love here, one must first understand the world in which it bloomed. Because love in the Middle Ages was not wild and unbridled. It was not about passion rushing in or fate uncoiling. Love, back then, was a careful thing, a quiet thing, often planned, rarely spoken, and sometimes never truly understood until years had passed. There was no such thing as dating in the way we know it now. No candlelit restaurants, no poetry over the phone, no long walks under city lights. But that did not mean there was no romance. On the contrary, the medieval world was full of yearning, but it wore different clothes. In villages scattered across Europe, most people were peasants, bound to the land and to the seasons. Marriage among them was practical. Who would help? Bring in the wheat? Who could tend the goats? These were questions just as important as whether a boy liked a girl. Romantic love might play a role, but it was often a gentle shadow behind duty. Families met, dowries were discussed, neighbors whispered. If the match was suitable, the path to marriage was trodden with quiet acceptance, not grand declarations. Still, even among the lowborn, hearts fluttered. A glance over the communal well, a shy smile exchanged while mending nets, a sprig of flowers left where someone would surely find it. These small, almost invisible acts carried weight. For those with little else, such gestures became entire poems. High above, the nobility lived by different rules, and yet, love still strained at the same leashes. Noble marriages were political instruments. Who you wed could shape the future of landholdings, allegiances, even peace between rival houses. A duke's daughter might be promised in marriage before she could even speak her own name. A baron's son might be sent to another court to secure an alliance by charm alone. And yet, in this world of arranged unions, an idea began to bloom, a kind of love not bound by duty. It was called courtly love, and it was as sweet as it was doomed. Knight, young and pious, might fall in love with a married lady, not carnally, but spiritually. He would compose songs in her honor, joust with her name upon his lips, and serve her from afar. This love was meant to elevate, not to possess. It was love as literature, as performance, as longing made noble. Imagine, now a grand hall lit by candles and the soft flicker of a hearth. A lady sits, her gown embroidered with vines and stars. A troubadour sings, his voice trembling with devotion. His love for her is pure, hopeless, and beautiful. He will never kiss her hand, and yet, in his suffering, he finds purpose. But not all in the church looked kindly upon this growing romantic ideal. The church had its own ideas about love, and those ideas were powerful. Marriage, according to doctrine, was a sacred union ordained by God. It was not to be entered lightly, nor without the blessing of clergy. Rules abounded: no close kin, no secret unions, no weddings during Lent. Marriage was not for pleasure. It was for children, for legacy, and above all for the salvation of the soul. And yet even the most pious could not cage the human heart. Hidden romances thrived in abbeys and monasteries, in shadowed gardens and under cloistered arches. Confessions were whispered, forgiveness was begged, and life, in all its stubborn sweetness, carried on. So where then did love truly live in the medieval world? Not in palaces, perhaps, not even in chapels. Love lived in between, in the soft spaces, in the unspoken. It lived in a letter smuggled under a sleeve, in a carved name on a barn beam, in a song sung too softly to be heard, in waiting. This world, its quiet rules, its soft rebellions, its aching formality, is where our journey begins. A world that did not yet know the term romantic, and yet in its own stifled way longed for it all the same. We begin not with a kiss, but with a glance. Not with a vow, but with a pause. Not with a storm, but with stillness. And in that stillness, love stirs. The sun rises slowly over a landscape of soft hills and waking birds. A layer of mist clings to the earth like a second skin, and the world, for a moment, is hushed. A peasant woman bends to draw water from the well. The bucket creaks against the rope, and in the nearby field, a boy gathers kindling with practiced ease. They exchange no words, only a glance. And in that glance, as old as time, there is a question, a hope, a promise, perhaps. Love in the medieval village did not begin with declarations. It began in the rhythm of daily life, in shared work, in borrowed tools, in the routines of a world ruled by the harvest and the church bell. Most peasants, who made up more than 90% of the population, were born, lived, and died within the same few square miles. They knew their neighbors intimately. A marriage was not a journey into the unknown. It was often a weaving of two families who had always shared fence lines and feast days, but that did not mean romance was absent. On the contrary, love among the peasant class was perhaps more quietly genuine than anywhere else. Because it grew, not from titles or poetry, but from the daily experience of watching someone carry water, knead dough, tend animals, or mend clothes. Attraction was rooted in rhythm, in competence, in kindness shown with no expectation. Courtship, if it can be called that, often took place during communal tasks. At planting time, boys and girls worked in adjacent rows. During harvest, laughter and songs lightened long days under the sun. At village festivals, especially during midsummer or religious feast days, young people might steal a dance, share a drink, or exchange shy gifts, a ribbon, a carved token, a small pouch of herbs. These were brief moments of lightness in lives mostly lived under obligation, and yet, in them, futures were decided. Parental involvement was significant. Most peasant marriages were arranged with the input of families. Fathers considered the strength and reliability of a potential son-in-law. Mothers looked for signs of domestic skill and good temperament in a daughter-in-law. While young people had some say, the match had to be practical. Could he build a home? Could she manage a household? Love was not the starting point. It was the hoped-for outcome. And yet love often followed, slowly, subtly. Imagine a newlywed couple, Mathieu and Hélène. Their home is a simple cottage with one room, one window, and a low fire that never quite goes out. They sleep on straw, eat mostly bread and broth, and work from dawn until stars appear. But in the way Hélène folds Mathieu's tunic just so, or the way he brings her wildflowers without a word, we see it. Affection, growing not in bursts, but in layers. There are no grand gestures. But when she falls ill, he fetches the priest and herbs in the same breath. When his mother dies, she holds his hand through a silence deeper than words. When the first frost comes and they are down to one salted fish and a bit of rye, they laugh anyway. This is peasant love, not lyrical, but enduring, of course not always gentle. Villages held their share of secrets and sorrows. Premarital pregnancies were not uncommon. The church frowned deeply upon them, but priests were often pragmatic. A couple caught in such a situation might be married quickly, with penance assigned. Afterward, the child would be baptized without delay and life would go on. Some unions were unhappy, just as they are today. Men drank too much. Women grieved silently. But divorce was not an option. Separation was rare and scandalous. Couples were expected to endure, even if affection faded. Yet amidst hardship, beauty remained. Many couples learned to love deeply after marriage. They became partners not just in labor but in survival. They shared the weight of seasons, the loss of children, the joy of births, the small miracle of growing old. Religion gave their love context and continuity. Marriage was a sacrament, and each household a miniature church. The couple prayed together, confessed together, and were buried side by side beneath a wooden cross. Community, too, wrapped around them like a woven shawl. Weddings were public affairs, with music, food, and wine, however meager. Everyone came. Everyone blessed the union. And in the laughter of children running through the fields, in the clinking of mugs and the stomping of feet on dirt floors, joy took root. So many of these stories are lost to time. No poems preserve their love, no paintings, no heraldry. But perhaps we can remember them in the way bread still smells when baking, in the ache of hands after working all day, in the quiet smile shared over a modest table. Not all love is loud. Some of it is humble, sun-warmed, and dust-covered. Some of it just stays. High above the fields and the forest paths, above the barns and humble hearths, stood the castles, cold, vast, and unyielding. Their stone walls bore witness to a very different kind of love. Here, in these echoing halls lit by torches and tapestries, the noble classes of medieval Europe played out their own dramas of romance, not among wheat and water, but amidst alliances and ambition. Marriage among the nobility was rarely about hearts. It was about holdings. A daughter was a pawn, a son, a bridge between powerful houses. A wedding was a treaty dressed in silks. The higher the rank, the greater the stakes. A single union could seal decades of peace or spark a war. Castles, titles, dowries, land, all wrote on who said, "I do." And yet, even within these stiff and gilded arrangements, love sometimes crept in like ivy between the stones. Let us begin with the formalities. A noble courtship was a matter of strategy. Parents, often long before a child reached maturity, began to plot suitable matches. Heralds were dispatched, letters sent. Negotiations could last years. A baron's daughter might be promised at the age of 6 to a future count. A second son seeking to rise might be matched to a rich heiress twice his age. The bride and groom themselves were often last to know, and when they did find out, they rarely had the power to refuse. Weddings were spectacles. The bride's gown, stiff with embroidery and meaning. The groom's coat of arms shining from every surface. There was food, music, revelry, but always a sense that this was not two lives joining freely, but two families making a very careful bet. Still, the heart cannot always be ruled by reason. In this world of planned futures, another concept took root, a strange, idealized version of love known as courtly love. Unlike marriage, courtly love was not about power. It was about longing, about admiration from afar. It was, above all else, chaste. A knight, often younger or of lower status, would fall in love with a noble lady, sometimes married, always unattainable. He would pledge himself to her service, write poems, win tournaments in her honor. His love was never expected to be consummated. It was meant to elevate him, to refine his soul through suffering. In literature, this love was noble, purifying, and deeply dramatic. In life, it was sometimes more complicated. Some such romances remained in the realm of fantasy. Others did not. A glance across a feast hall could turn into whispered secrets behind arrases. A letter left beneath a pillow. A rose placed on a windowsill at dawn. Discretion was everything, and punishment could be severe. But within the strictures of noble life, even these stolen moments offered something genuine. Consider a young lady, perhaps named Isabeau, born to a family of ancient name. She is taught from childhood to embroider, to dance, to speak 3 languages, and to remain obedient. At 16, she is sent to marry a man twice her age. He is not cruel but not kind. He speaks more to his hawks than to her. In the hush of her chamber, she dreams not of escape but of something more. A troubadour comes to court. He sings songs that make her fingers pause in their stitching. Later, in the rose garden, he catches her eye and bows too long. Nothing is said. Nothing must be said, but her heart beats differently. That night, she sleeps with her hand over her chest. Love in the noble class was a risk. For women, it was also dangerous. An affair discovered could mean exile, annulment, disgrace, or worse. For men, the consequences were lighter, unless the lady in question was royal. Still, many noble women wielded their own quiet power. They arranged letters, chose ladies-in-waiting carefully, managed estates, and raised children to continue their lineage. Some ruled as regents, some led armies, and some, in the folds of night and the cover of ritual, carved out moments of softness, however fleeting. Despite its constraints, noble life was rich with symbolism. Lovers, both real and literary, used metaphors of birds, gardens, and stars. A lady might gift her favor a ribbon or a glove. A knight might wear it into battle or tuck it into his armor before a tournament. These tokens became talismans, proof that something tender had passed between them. So we return to the castle. The fires crackle. The corridors are quiet. A young knight kneels in prayer, not just to God, but to the image of a woman who has never spoken his name. A lady walks the parapets, her veil trailing in the wind. Her marriage lies ahead, her life decided. But her thoughts, they are her own. This is noble love, not free, not equal, and yet, somehow, achingly human. Not every story ended in tragedy. Some couples, arranged though they were, grew to love each other deeply. They raised children, weathered politics, grew old side by side. Like trees planted close, their roots tangled quietly over time. Not every vow was political. Not every kiss was stolen. Not every glance led to ruin. But every story, even the ones forgotten, carried with it the strange tension of a world where duty and desire never quite aligned. And perhaps that's what made the love of castles so compelling. It was never simple, and it was never safe. But sometimes, it was real. Long before the age of handwritten sonnets or digital declarations, love found its voice in small, quiet ways. A glance held a heartbeat longer than it should. A ribbon tied just so. A sprig of rosemary slipped into a basket without a word. The medieval world, bound as it was by strict customs, class divides, and ever-watchful eyes, romantic expression was often subtle, symbolic, and laced with risk. Love was rarely shouted from rooftops. It was whispered in corners, smuggled between bread and barley, hidden in plain sight. This, then, is the language of tokens. Let us begin with the eyes. A simple gaze exchanged across a market stall or during Mass could say everything. A lingering glance was never just an accident. Eye contact had weight. In a world where conversation between unmarried men and women was limited and often supervised, the eyes became instruments of longing. And if they lingered too long, a knowing smile might follow, or a sudden turn away, cheeks flushed. Next came gestures, a touch of the sleeve, a hand brushing another during a shared chore, helping someone lift a heavy sack even when it wasn't necessary. These were not just acts of kindness, they were chances to be near. In a society where propriety ruled, proximity was itself a form of rebellion. But most powerful of all were the tokens. Physical objects, tiny, personal, and often handmade, carried immense emotional weight. A token was not merely a gift. It was a message encoded in fabric or wood, and meant to be interpreted carefully by its recipient. A glove, for instance, was no ordinary accessory. To give someone your glove, or even just one, was a sign of favor. Knights would often wear a lady's glove tied to their armor during a tournament. It meant she watched over him, believed in him, stood symbolically by his side. The glove became a talisman, a shield of affection. A belt or girdle was even more intimate. It encircled the waist, close to the body. To give such a gift was to offer not just sentiment but trust. In some courtly traditions, a knight might receive a lady's girdle as a reward for bravery or fidelity, a highly personal keepsake with layers of meaning. Handkerchiefs, delicately embroidered with initials or symbols, also played a role. Light and portable, they could be pressed into a hand during parting or left behind intentionally. The scent of lavender or rosewater might linger, a sensory reminder of the giver's presence. In rural settings, tokens took on even simpler forms. Woven ribbon, dyed with natural colors tied discreetly around the wrist. A carved wooden heart or charm, etched during long winter nights and slipped into a lover's pocket at a festival. A herb pouch, sewn with calming plants like chamomile or yarrow, given as both a comfort and a subtle nod of affection. Each object spoke in a dialect of gesture and restraint. Consider a young woman, Marjorie, who embroiders a narrow strip of linen during the evenings. It bears no name, but its patterns echo the sigil of a certain boy's family. When the harvest fair arrives, she places it in a basket of bread and passes it casually to his mother. Nothing is said, but when the boy eats the bread and finds the cloth tucked beneath the loaf, he smiles, heart suddenly lighter. Or imagine a squire named Hal, too low-born to speak directly to the lady he admires. Instead, he carves a small rose from birchwood. He leaves it on the step of the chapel where she always pauses after Mass. She never speaks of it, but the next day she wears a rose-shaped brooch that did not exist before. Even flowers and herbs carried messages. Long before the Victorian language of flowers, medieval Europe already ascribed meanings to plants. Rosemary for remembrance, rue for regret or repentance, hawthorn for hope, lavender for devotion, violets for modesty. A simple posy gathered from the edge of a forest and tied with a twist of wool could say what words could not. But not all tokens were physical. Sometimes the most powerful signs of affection came through shared silence. A familiar song hummed nearby, or the deliberate choosing of the same pew during services. A man might rise early to cut wood for a widow's fire. A woman might leave an extra egg on a doorstep. Love wove itself through kindness. Of course, tokens could also be misunderstood. A gift meant in friendship might be mistaken for affection. A well-meant ribbon might draw gossip. In tightly knit communities, a token rarely remained a secret for long. That's what made them so delicate and so thrilling. For noble lovers, these signs were no less loaded. A princess could not be seen speaking freely to a knight, but she could drop her handkerchief accidentally. He would retrieve it solemnly and keep it close. For her, it was a message sent. For him, it was a memory held. Even poetry, when exchanged, acted as a kind of living token. Rhymed lines written in code with symbols instead of names circulated among courtiers. A poem hidden beneath a book or recited under one's breath near the window of a lady's chamber became a bridge between propriety and desire. So much of love in the Middle Ages lived in suggestion. The world then was less private, more watched. But even so, lovers found a way to speak. To say, I see you, or I wait for you, or simply, I remember, not with declarations, not with rings, but with a glove, a gaze, a braid of red thread, and in the quiet flicker of those tokens, something eternal stirred. Beyond the hedgerows and fields, past the bustle of market towns and the echoing halls of noble courts, stood the monasteries, solid, silent, set apart. Their stone walls were thick, their windows narrow. Their bells tolled not for trade or feasts, but for prayer, for silence, for surrender. And yet, even here, love found cracks in the stone. The medieval monastery was meant to be a place outside of the world. To take holy orders was to abandon family, property, and desire. Monks and nuns vowed chastity, poverty, obedience. Their days were mapped by the hours of prayer, the divine office, and their nights by candlelight and contemplation. But humans are not made of stone, and in the stillness of the cloister, when the sky grew dark and the corridors quiet, a different sort of longing sometimes stirred. Let us begin with the cause: loneliness. Many who entered monastic life did so by choice, drawn to devotion. But many others were sent, especially women. A daughter without dowry might be placed in a convent, not out of spiritual calling, but as an economical decision. Some were as young as 12. their heads shaved, their futures sealed with a veil and a psalter. Over time, they adapted. They learned the chants, the herbs, the rules. But still, the heart remembered. A young novice might look too long at the abbess's assistant. A scribe might linger in the scriptorium to glimpse the face of a lay sister bringing bread. These moments were fleeting, quiet, and often confusing. But they were real. For monks, isolation could breed other kinds of temptations. Some experienced intense inner battles which they recorded in journals or confessed repeatedly. The devil, they believed, took many forms, often the form of a beautiful face in a dream, or a memory that would not fade. Church authorities were well aware of these human struggles. Monastic rules were strict.
Men and women were kept entirely separate. Cloisters were enclosed, conversations with outsiders were limited, and private contact was forbidden. Even among themselves, monks and nuns were expected to avoid intimacy. But life is not always lived according to expectation. There are records scattered,
Hidden, scandalous, of monks who broke their vows, of nuns who bore children, of secret meetings behind garden walls. These stories did not make it into hagiographies or sermons, but they lived in whispered tales and buried letters. Imagine, for a moment, a Benedictine monk named Thomas. He is 35, disciplined, respected. He rises before dawn, prays with the choir, tends the garden, copies manuscripts with careful hand. But one autumn, a group of nuns arrive seeking refuge from a distant convent caught in war. Among them is Sister Juliana. She is not beautiful by the world's measure, but her voice, when she sings, draws something forward in Thomas that he thought long buried. They speak only briefly, during shared prayers. Once he hands her a psalter, left in the chapel. Their fingers touch. It is enough. For weeks he avoids her. He prays harder. He fasts. But the longing does not leave. One evening he finds a sprig of dried lavender tucked into his Bible. There is no note, but the meaning is clear. They never speak of it aloud. But for years, each keeps the memory. It is both a weight and a warmth. A forbidden flame, hidden but never extinguished. Not all such stories were so contained. In some monasteries, passion led to scandal. Affairs were discovered, lovers exiled, entire communities reprimanded. And yet, even in the aftermath, the church rarely sought public humiliation. Instead, transgressors were often reassigned, quietly disciplined, or required to undertake harsher penance. The tension between desire and devotion was not seen as weakness, but as a test. To struggle was human, to confess, divine. For women especially, these forbidden affections were complex. The convent was both prison and refuge. For some, it was the only place where they could read, write, and think freely. Bonds between nuns were often deep, lifelong, and intensely emotional. Were they romantic? Sometimes. Often not. But the intimacy was real. The church had little language for such affection. Female friendship, especially among cloistered sisters, was accepted as long as it remained chaste. But history tells us of nuns who wrote each other letters full of longing, of sisters who refused to be separated even in death. One 14th century letter, preserved in a forgotten ledger, reads, "When I hear your voice in prayer, I feel as though the sun has returned to the cloister. Do not let them send you away." Simple words, but in them, a world. So, was there love behind monastery walls? Yes, but it was not always sinful. Sometimes it was patient, sometimes painful, sometimes platonic, sometimes desperate. It took many forms: quiet companionship, shared grief, wordless connection. It is easy to imagine monks and nuns as cold, distant, untouchable, but they were no less human than the villagers and nobles outside. Their vows may have been eternal, but their hearts beat just the same. They longed. They wept. They wondered. And in the margins of their manuscripts, in the folds of their habits, in the gardens where they walked alone beneath the moon, love whispered still, not loud, not proud, but persistent. Love is a traveler. Even in the age of carts and calluses, when oceans meant months of peril and borders were drawn with blades, the heart, somehow, still managed to wander. In the medieval world, where most never journeyed beyond their village, those who did, pilgrims, crusaders, merchants, scholars, brought back more than relics and spices. Sometimes they brought stories, and sometimes they brought love. Let us begin on the pilgrim road. Picture a dusty path winding southward through the fields of France. Pilgrims move in clusters, some barefoot, some with wooden staffs adorned with scallop shells. They walk toward Santiago de Compostela, or Rome or Jerusalem, driven by faith, penance, or longing. Among them is Alice, a young widow from Normandy. She walks quietly, clutching a satchel filled with bread, dried apples, and a single worn psalter. Along the way, she meets Yusuf, a scholar from Cordoba, traveling in the opposite direction toward Paris to study theology. Their languages are fractured. Their faiths diverge. But over a shared campfire in a wooded glade, they exchange more than words. They trade songs, hers soft and mournful, his rhythmic and strange. They smile. They part. But the next day, they meet again. And again. There is no promise, no vow, but there is a tenderness that stretches across belief and geography, a reminder that human connection cares little for maps. Such encounters were not rare. Pilgrimages, far from being solitary acts of devotion, were deeply social. Men and women walked together, cooked together, slept near one another under the stars. Laughter mingled with prayer. Friendships formed. And sometimes, affection bloomed. Church officials worried about this. Pilgrims were expected to remain chaste, focused, and disciplined. But people are people. And when walls fall away, when strangers become familiar, when the road is long and the heart unguarded, intimacy can arise like dawn over a quiet hill. Even more complicated were the loves that formed between faiths and empires. During the Crusades, Christian knights marched east to reclaim Jerusalem. Their swords clashed with those of Muslim warriors, and their banners bore holy insignia. But beyond the battlefield, another reality took shape. In cities like Antioch, Acre, and Jerusalem, cultures mingled. Traders bartered in shared markets. Languages mixed: French, Arabic, Latin, Greek. And among the olive groves and tiled courtyards, something unusual happened. Some Christians and Muslims began to fall in love. It was rare. It was dangerous. But it was not impossible. A knight from Burgundy might find himself captivated by the daughter of a Muslim physician who tended his wounds. A Saracen merchant might exchange more than spices with the wife of a Templar gone too long. Such affairs were often whispered, hidden beneath veils and behind shutters. But history remembers them, barely, delicately, as signs that even in times of war the heart can rebel. Of course, these romances were fraught. Religion was not just belief, it was identity. To love someone of another faith meant navigating suspicion, rejection, and risk. Families forbade it, clergy condemned it. But some quietly chose love anyway. One story, half legend, half recorded, tells of a Frankish scribe named Guillaume who worked in a court in Damascus. There he fell in love with Layla, a calligrapher whose Arabic flowed like water over parchment. They met over manuscripts, their fingers stained with ink. They spoke through translation and touch. They never married. But they wrote to each other for decades. Their letters, long lost, were said to have once filled a cedar chest. Not all cross-cultural loves were doomed. In port cities like Venice, Constantinople, and Cairo, merchants from all corners of the known world met and mingled. Venetian traders married Greek women. Armenian women wed Genoese captains. Mongol envoys sent gifts to Byzantine princesses. The Silk Roads did not only carry goods, they carried hearts. These unions were practical at times, alliances made for trade. But often they grew into something more. Love built not just from curiosity but respect, from shared meals, shared laughter, and shared years. Still, cultural difference brought tension. What food to eat, what gods to honor, what language to teach the children. And yet, these couples endured, they adapted, they blended, and in doing so, they proved something quietly powerful. That love is not about sameness, but about grace. One can imagine a dinner table in Cyprus, a Frankish husband pouring olive oil over lentils prepared by his Levantine wife, their child asking why some people pray with beads and others with bows. The answer would come slowly, gently, like waves against the shore. Even language, so often a barrier, could become a bridge. Lovers who did not share the same tongue found other ways to speak. Through music, through food, through the eyes. A smile needs no translator, nor does a sigh. So we return to the road, to the caravanserai in Persia, where a tired priest and a curious widow discuss the stars. To the port of Alexandria, where a Jewish physician translates a Greek love poem for a Coptic nurse. To the narrow alleyways of Jerusalem, where two figures pass, brush shoulders, and pause. For a heartbeat, the world is quiet. And in that, quiet across all the divides of culture, language, and faith, love stirs. Not loudly, not often, but enough. Because love is always curious, and the heart has always been a traveler. Not every love in the Middle Ages could bloom under the same roof. Often the ones most deeply felt were those lived in separation, by distance, by war, by duty, or by fate. And so, the medieval heart, when parted from its other half, did what hearts have always done. It waited, it hoped, and it wrote. Distance was not measured in miles, but in longing. There was no instant communication, no flickering message on a screen. A letter, sent by courier or pilgrim or caravan, might take weeks, months, sometimes it never arrived at all. And yet lovers wrote them anyway, with ink made of ash and gall, on parchment scraped thin, by candlelight or by fading daylight. These letters were not casual, they were lifelines. Each word carried weight. Each pause between lines held a breath. They began with formalities, as was proper. To my most cherished, or to the lady, whose memory warms me as the fire once did. But soon formality gave way to the pulse beneath, to the ache of absence. One letter, preserved in a 13th century ledger in Poitiers, begins, "Since the day of your leaving, I am as a ship unmoored, my bed is cold, my thoughts are clouds without shape. I pray each morning not for salvation but for your return." The man who wrote it was a minor knight. The woman, his wife, remained at their manor in Gascony. He never returned from war. But the letter remained folded in her psalter. For those separated by pilgrimage or crusade, writing became sacred. Husbands promised their wives they would return bearing relics and gifts. Wives promised to keep the hearth warm, the fields sown, the children clothed. But promises could not keep away fear. Letters often included worries, veiled in poetry. "I heard of sickness in the East," or "Tell me truly, do you still wear my ring?" Sometimes the replies never came. In those silences, the imagination took over. Lovers dreamed of each other's faces, aged by time or touched by sunlight. They imagined touch, voice, breath. The mind filled in where ink had stopped. In this way, distance was not just endured, it was romanticized. This longing gave birth to a whole tradition of love poetry, elegies, laments, sonnets full of yearning. The troubadours of southern France sang of amour de loin, love from afar. To love someone unreachable, unseen, sometimes even unknown, it was not considered foolish but noble. Purifying. A way of elevating the soul through suffering. One famous troubadour, Geoffrey Rudel, wrote, "I have never seen her, but I love her still. For her my thoughts are wings, and my sighs, the wind that carries them." He spoke of a distant princess. Whether she was real or imagined mattered less than the feeling itself. Distance made love holy. But not all such longing was abstract. a merchant in Bruges, writing to his betrothed in Florence, detailed not only his profits but the color of the sky he wished she could see. He enclosed a pressed violet from the hills outside the city, wrapped in linen. He ended his letter not with a signature but with a traced outline of his hand, so she might place hers against it. For those who could not write, tokens served instead. A ring returned, a lock of hair sealed in wax, a braid of thread knotted in patterns known only to two. In monasteries, separated friends and forbidden lovers exchanged coded messages in psalm references. Psalm 42 whispered not of devotion to God but of thirst for someone's presence. Parents, too, wrote to children far away, their affection tender, filled with the same ache. A father at war sent drawings of animals to his daughter with notes like, "This bear is you, brave and strong." A mother enclosed a scrap of cloth from her shawl for her son in a distant abbey. Even noble marriages, arranged and duty-bound, sometimes blossomed in separation. A countess in Aquitaine sent her husband, gone to crusade, a box of dried rose petals, and a note that read, "So that the scent of our garden may travel farther than I can." He returned 5 years later with a necklace carved from cedar, still holding her name. But distance was not only across lands. Sometimes it lay in the heart. Two people in the same village, bound by expectation to others, might write only in metaphor. A woman might sing a song at the well, using verses to speak what she could not say aloud. A man might carve symbols into a tree, a silent alphabet between them. In these subtle dances, love stretched, transformed, survived. And so we see that longing is not a weakness, but a form of devotion. It is in the waiting, the listening for hooves on the road, the checking of the horizon, the folding and unfolding of a letter already memorized. Love, when forced to live at a distance, becomes distilled. Fewer words but deeper ones. Fewer moments but more sacred. It teaches patience, imagination, hope. And even when distance wins, when letters stop, when news fails to come, when years pass without reunion, something remains. The warmth in a scarf kept beside the bed. The line of a poem remembered in the dark. The breath drawn before sleep, whispered with a name. So if you ever feel far from someone, imagine this: a candle, a quill, a scrap of parchment. A hand, trembling slightly, writes, "I miss you. I wait, I remember." And that message, written centuries ago, still echoes tonight. Bells are ringing, not the clamor of war nor the toll of mourning, but the joyful, rhythmic peal of celebration. Today, there is to be a wedding. And in the medieval world, a wedding was not merely a personal affair. It was a public, sacred, and social event, woven deeply into the very fabric of life, rich in symbol, ritual, and quiet hope. Let us follow the day from the beginning. The morning sun rises slowly over a thatched village. The scent of baking bread and crushed herbs wafts through the cool air. Children run barefoot, chasing chickens from the path. And somewhere, behind a shuttered door, a young bride is being dressed. She wears no ivory gown, no veil of diamonds. Her dress is her best woolen one, perhaps newly dyed. If she is fortunate, it bears delicate embroidery at the cuffs, a gift from her mother. Her hair is braided, coiled atop her head, and a garland of dried flowers rests gently in place. She is quiet, not from nerves, but from reverence. In another home, the groom tightens his belt. He carries no ring box. Instead, a small cloth pouch with 2 silver coins, part of the dowry perhaps, and a sprig of rosemary for memory. Their wedding will be held not in grandeur, but in presence. In the eyes of the church, marriage was a sacrament, and like all sacraments, it required witness and blessing. The ceremony took place at the church door, symbolizing the threshold between public life and sacred union. There, the couple would speak their vows, not in private, but in front of neighbors, friends, and the ever-watchful priest. The vows themselves were simple, solemn, and binding. I take thee to be my wedded husband, wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. The hands would be joined, sometimes with a strip of cloth or ribbon symbolizing the tying of the knot. A ring, if given, was plain, gold if one could afford it, iron or bronze otherwise. Then came the blessing. The priest would call upon saints and angels to guard this union. He might sprinkle holy water, he might offer a small psalm, and when it was done, the newlyweds would step across the threshold into the church to hear Mass together as husband and wife. There was no kiss to seal the deal. That part came later. If the couple were nobles, the ceremony was far more elaborate. A noble wedding was a matter of politics and performance. The bride might be 14, the groom 25. Their union arranged by parents long before they were met. But still, the day would be filled with pomp. Fine fabrics, banners, trumpets, and feasts. The ceremony might be held in a grand cathedral. The bishop himself might preside. Relics might be presented. Chants sung by choirs of monks. A dozen witnesses would sign the marriage contract with wax seals, each more ornate than the last. But even amid formality, there were moments of softness. Young Duke might squeeze his bride's hand during the vows, feeling her tremble. A countess might hide a token, perhaps a tiny carved dove, in her new husband's glove, a secret shared only between them. After the ceremony came the celebration. Weddings, no matter the class, were moments of joy for the whole community. The feast could last a day, sometimes more. There would be bread and meat, mead and ale, fruit preserved in honey and roasted fowl, often the finest meal many would eat that year. Musicians played flutes and drums, dancers circled under garlands, children ran freely while elders drank deeply. And the couple? They would sit together, perhaps for the first time ever, and simply watch it all. In some villages, old customs persisted. A bride might be led to her new home with songs and laughter. A groom might carry her across the threshold, not out of tradition, but to avoid bad luck. The bed would be blessed. Sometimes a priest would remain just long enough to ensure the marriage was, as they said, consummated in grace. These rituals might seem strange to modern eyes, but in them lay centuries of meaning. Marriage was not simply a joining of two people. It was a joining of two families, two households, two sets of futures, and so the village watched, not out of nosiness, but out of care. Their presence was a kind of protection, a kind of welcome. But beneath all the structure, all the ceremony, there was always emotion. A young bride might steal a glance at her groom and wonder, will he be kind? A groom might watch his wife laugh with her sisters and think, I want to protect that sound. A mother might cry quietly, remembering her own wedding, long faded. A father might grip the edge of the table, pride and fear battling in his chest, because marriage in every age is a leap, a promise, a hope, a threshold stepped over together. And even if the love came later, as it often did, it came sturdier, for having been forged in ritual and witnessed by many. So tonight, as the fire dies down and the guests wander home, the couple remains, in a new home, in a new chapter. They may not know each other well, they may not speak much, but in the silence, something stirs. Two breaths, one roof, and the sacred echo of the words, still lingering at the church door. The sun has long since dipped below the horizon. The candles flicker low. Outside, the village rests, wrapped in the hush of night. Inside a modest cottage, or perhaps within the thick walls of a castle chamber, two people sit quietly beside a fire. They are newlywed. Their guests have left. The music has faded. The wine is gone. And now, there is only silence. The medieval marriage bed, simple as straw-stuffed linen or grand as carved oak, was not just a place for sleep. It was a place of duty, of custom, of nervous anticipation, and sometimes, if one was lucky, a place of tenderness. Let us begin with expectation. In the eyes of the church and society, marriage was not truly complete until it had been consummated. This meant more than physical union, it meant proof of it. Especially in noble households, witnesses might wait outside the chamber, listening. Sheets might be inspected, testimonies gathered. To modern minds, this seems intrusive. But to medieval families, a valid marriage, one that could produce heirs, was too important to leave to assumption. For peasants, there was less scrutiny, but the expectation remained. A couple who failed to come together might face suspicion. Was he impotent? Was she unwilling? Could they produce children? And yet, within these heavy expectations, very human emotions stirred. Nervousness, awkwardness, hope, and for many a fear. Many brides, especially those very young or from cloistered households, had little understanding of what would take place. Some had been warned, some had been lied to. Others simply hoped it would be quick. Grooms, too, were not always confident, especially if the match was arranged, if affection had not yet bloomed, or if the bride was a stranger in both name and touch. And so, the first night was often tentative. A few words, a glance, a prayer mumbled aloud. In some traditions, couples were even expected to pray together before lying down, asking for God's blessing upon their union. The bed itself was symbolic. In many homes, it was the most valuable piece of furniture, carved by hand, draped in heavy cloth, shared not just by husband and wife, but often by infants, small children, and even servants. But on the wedding night, the bed became a private world. In it, two people, sometimes young, sometimes not, discovered each other. Slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes not at all. For some, the night passed in clumsy silence. For others, it was the start of a bond. Still others postponed it altogether. Overwhelmed by exhaustion or emotion, there were no manuals, no trusted guides. What little knowledge existed came from whispers, tavern songs, or poorly remembered sermons. And yet, despite the awkwardness, intimacy bloomed. Not in the act itself necessarily, but in what followed. The first time a husband turned toward his wife in sleep and felt her breath on his chest. The first time a bride touched her husband's hand without flinching. The first morning they woke together, side by side as light filtered through the shutters. This was how closeness grew, in slowness, in repetition, in the simple act of sharing space. Of course, not all first nights were kind. Some unions were forced. Some brides cried. Some grooms were cruel. The medieval world, like our own, held shadows. But history does not only record the worst. Between the grim stories are glimmers of gentleness, of couples who waited, of men who spoke softly, of women who in time reached for the hand they once feared. The church preached that sex within marriage was not sinful, but neither was it to be enjoyed too freely. Its purpose was procreation, and priests urged moderation. Too much passion, even between husband and wife, was frowned upon. Still, the rules were often bent in the privacy of the hearth. In literature, the marriage bed became a place of metaphor. Poets wrote of gardens, of fruit, of rivers flowing. The act itself was rarely named. Instead, love was described in symbols: apples, silk, birds nesting. These gentle metaphors helped preserve modesty, but also allowed room for imagination. Consider for a moment a story. A merchant and his wife, wed late in life. They had known each other as neighbors for decades. When they married, there was no great fanfare, but on their first night, he brought her a cup of warm milk. She smiled and set it on the bedside. He lit one candle, not for sight, but for comfort. They did not speak much, but before sleep took them, she reached beneath the pillow and placed a ribbon there, the same one he had admired 10 years before, when she wore it to market. He laughed, quietly, and kissed her forehead. That, too, was intimacy. And what of love? Love did not always arrive with the wedding. Often it came later, built not in passion, but in habit. A man learns the shape of his wife's size. A woman memorizes the sound of her husband's boots on stone. They quarrel. They reconcile, they age, and each night they return to the same bed, not because they must, but because they have come to belong there. So let us end where we began. The fire is low. The bed is warm. Outside, an owl calls to no one. Two people lie close, uncertain of what tomorrow holds, but certain of one thing: they are not alone. And that is a beginning. Morning light spills across the wooden floor of a quiet cottage. The fire has long gone cold, but in the cradle near the hearth a child stirs. Small, soft, wrapped in wool, unaware that their very breath is the answer to 1,000 silent prayers. For, in the medieval world, the birth of a child was more than the beginning of life. It was the continuation of hope. When two people married, love was hoped for. Companionship was prayed for. But children? They were expected, needed, welcomed with joy, and sometimes with trembling. Let us begin with the hope. A woman, perhaps young, perhaps weathered by seasons already, places a hand to her stomach and feels something. A flutter, a fullness, a possibility. Pregnancy was not confirmed with tests or charts. It was guessed by missed cycles, strange cravings, fatigue. The midwives, old women who had seen more births than funerals, would watch the woman closely, touch her wrist, smell her skin, offer herbs for strength. When the truth was known, there was celebration, but also fear. Childbirth in the middle, ages, was perilous. Every mother knew someone who had not survived it. Every father had stood outside a door, listening for a cry that never came. And yet, they hoped. Because children were the bridge between now and tomorrow. They were laborers for the field, protectors of the home, and perhaps most importantly, reminders that love, in its simplest form, could grow. When a child was born, the village paused. A baby's first cry was met with prayers and salt. Salt to ward off evil, salt to preserve what was still so new. The midwife would wash the infant, swaddle them tight, and whisper a blessing. And then soon, sometimes within hours, the child was baptized. The church taught that a soul must not be left unblessed. Even the smallest, the frailest, the just born, were rushed to water that they might be claimed by heaven before death could claim them for anything else. If the child lived, a name was chosen, often from saints, grandparents, or seasons. Martin for a boy born near St. Martin's Day. Blanche for a winter child. Names held meaning. They were hopes spoken aloud. And from there, the work of parenting began. But in truth, it was not like modern parenting. Mothers and fathers rarely doted. Life was too hard, too short. Children were loved deeply, but they were also seen as part of the laboring whole. By age 3, a child could carry water. By 5, they helped feed animals. By 7, they watched younger siblings. There were games, yes, little wooden toys, chasing geese, singing rhymes. But there was always work. And yet amidst this hardship, there was joy. The joy of a child's laughter echoing across a courtyard. The sight of a small pair of feet following a father to the fields. The hush of a lullaby sung over a cradle at dusk. For noble families, children were legacy. A son was an heir. A daughter, a future alliance. Their births were recorded in ledgers marked with candles, celebrated with feasts. Tutors were hired, wet nurses employed. The child grew not just for the family, but for the name. But even in castles, a mother still wept at night when her child had a fever. A father still stood silently outside a sick room, his hands clasped in helpless prayer. Because love, when bound in blood, is both soft and sharp, and when that bond is broken, it leaves a silence that no feast, no priest, no chant can fill. Infant mortality was high in the medieval world. Disease, malnutrition, accidents all took children swiftly and without warning. It was not uncommon for a family to lose half their offspring before adulthood. Some coped by detachment. some by more prayer, some by holding the survivors even closer. There is a record from an English village, circa 1320, of a mother who lost 3 sons to the sweating sickness. She named her next child Pax, peace. He survived. She never stopped calling him her little promise. But not all stories end in loss. Many families, against the odds, thrived. Children grew tall and strong. They married, built homes, returned to visit the parents who had once held their heads in their palms. And when those parents grew old, gray, bent, fading, the roles reversed. A daughter brought broth and mended tunics. A son hauled wood and chased away rats. And a grandchild would sit beside the hearth listening to stories of a wedding long ago, of the moment his grandfather first touched his grandmother's hand. This was legacy. Not gold, not land, but memory, passed gently like a candle flame, from one hand to the next. Because in the end, parenthood in the Middle Ages was not about perfection. It was about presence. It was about surviving together. It was about planting something that might grow, even if you never lived to see it bloom. So tonight, as the fire crackles low and a mother leans over a cot to tuck in a child with dirty feet and tangled hair, remember this. In the hush of the medieval home where love rarely shouted but often stayed, a child's breath was the softest hymn, and a parent's love, the quietest prayer. Not all stories end with gentle hands and quiet joy. Even in the calm rhythms of medieval life, in fields and courts, cloisters and kitchens, hearts sometimes broke. Not with a shout, but with a silence. Not with thunder, but with a slow, aching distance. Love, when tested, did not always endure. In the Middle Ages, marriage was binding, not just legally, but spiritually. To separate from one's spouse was rare, difficult, and deeply discouraged. Divorce, in the way we know it now, did not exist in most of Christian Europe. At best, couples could obtain annulments under narrow and specific conditions: non-consummation, close kinship, or fraud. But where law was rigid, emotion was not. Jealousy, betrayal, disappointment. They lived behind the thickest castle walls and within the humblest thatched roofs. No vow, however sacred, could erase the frailty of the human heart. Let us begin with jealousy. It could creep in like smoke beneath a door. A husband who noticed his wife speaking too gently with a neighbor. A wife who saw her husband linger too long at the tavern, laughing with a girl who was not her. In villages, word spread fast. A lingering glance became a rumor. A missed evening became suspicion. And yet, confrontation was rare. Most couples did not speak directly of such things. They let the distance settle. A shared silence at the dinner table, a colder tone, a longer walk to the fields. Sometimes it passed. Sometimes it grew. For noble families, jealousy held higher stakes. A wife's infidelity could cast doubt on the legitimacy of heirs, an accusation that could destroy entire bloodlines. A husband's unfaithfulness, though more tolerated, still caused scandal, especially if he took a mistress publicly or neglected his duties. Records tell of queens who plotted from behind embroidered veils, of barons who locked their wives in towers, not for safety but to guard what they believed was theirs. And yet, jealousy was often not about power. It was about fear. Fear of being replaced, of being unloved, of being forgotten. That fear could twist into bitterness. But sometimes it broke instead into betrayal. Infidelity, while condemned by church and custom, still occurred, quietly, dangerously. A lonely wife might find solace in a servant's arms. A bored husband might visit another's hearth while on the road. Letters were hidden beneath floorboards. Meetings arranged in barns behind chapels, during festivals when eyes were elsewhere. Sometimes these affairs were brief, no more than moments of escape. Other times they grew into whispered, impossible loves. But when discovered, the consequences were sharp. For women, the punishment was often harsher. A wife caught in adultery could be cast out, sent to a convent, or even publicly shamed. For noble women, it meant losing titles, dowries, and children. Men, while often spared the harshest judgment, faced their own ruin, especially if the affair crossed political or religious lines. But perhaps worse than punishment was the quiet aftermath. A marriage, cracked by betrayal, continued out of necessity. The couple still worked the same land, slept under the same roof, prayed in the same pew. But something invisible had shifted. Trust, once broken, did not return easily. Yet, and here is where medieval love reveals its strange resilience, many couples endured, not because they forgot or forgave quickly, but because life required them to. There was wood to chop, bread to bake, children to raise. They moved forward not out of passion but persistence. Some found their way back, others never did. There were also those who drifted apart without betrayal, only weariness. Two people who once shared laughter now shared only chores. The days passed filled with duty but void of delight. They did not quarrel. They simply stopped trying. In such cases, love didn't shatter. It dissolved. And yet even here traces remained. A woman might still mend her husband's shirt. A man might still bring back extra oats for her hens. The gestures remained, though the heart had long since closed its shutters. For a rare few, separation occurred. Usually among the wealthy or powerful, a couple might seek legal separation, AICUI, process requiring permission from church authorities and based on serious grounds like cruelty, desertion, or grave misconduct. Even then, they were rarely free to remarry. Separation was not annulment. It was a pause, not an ending. And what of the children? They too bore the weight. They watched the silences, heard the unspoken, felt the tension in how doors closed or how chairs were pulled away just slightly too far. But they also saw the strength, the way some parents, despite all, chose still to sit side by side at feast days to bless their children's marriages, to remain present, because staying, even when love faltered, was seen as virtue, and sometimes the staying brought love back, not as it was in youth, with fire and music, but as embers that glowed low and steady. A husband who once strayed might, in old age, brush his wife's shoulder and whisper thanks. A wife who once wept alone might years later sit beside her husband in peace, sharing apples on a quiet bench. Because love does not always roar. Sometimes it returns like birds in spring, quiet, cautious, but real. So tonight, if your heart carries its own stories of betrayal, of distance, of sorrow, know this. Even in the Middle Ages, hearts broke, but they also mended. And in the quiet after storms came soft mornings, where two people once torn sat again at the same table and passed the bread. Love, like the seasons, does not always come just once. In the medieval world, where life was fragile and fate unkind, few people reached old age without tasting the bitter wine of loss. A fever, a war, a difficult birth, any could tear a beloved away in the space between dawn and dusk. And when it happened, when the laughter left the house, when the second chair at the table stayed empty, life somehow continued. But love, it did not always end. Sometimes it returned. This is the story of second chances. Let us begin with widowhood. To lose a spouse in the Middle Ages was not rare. It was expected. The average lifespan was short and the dangers many. For women especially, childbirth claimed countless lives. And for men, war and labor were often just as perilous. A widow or widower entered a new season, not just of grief, but of reevaluation. Who was she now that her husband was gone? What did he become now that he was no longer a husband? For women, widowhood came with both sorrow and freedom. A widow, particularly one of means, held a rare status in society. She could own land, manage property, make legal decisions. She was no longer under her father's or husband's rule. For some, it was the first time they truly lived as themselves. But the heart still remembered. There were rituals. A widow might wear black for a year. She might sleep alone, pray more often, or visit the grave daily with offerings of herbs, bread, or whispered stories. Yet with time, slowly, quietly, Some widows began to look forward again, perhaps not to grand romance, but to companionship, to warmth, and so some remarried. The church permitted remarriage, though not without condition. Widows were encouraged to grieve properly and to choose their next partner with care. For nobles, remarriage was often strategic. A widow with land or titles was rarely left single for long. But even among villagers, widows and widowers found each other. Sometimes it was practical. A woman with children needed help. A man alone on a farm needed hands. Their marriage might begin with a handshake, not a kiss, but sometimes something more flickered beneath. Picture a man named Henri. His wife died of fever after 20 years of marriage. For 2 winters he spoke little. His fields grew wild. He sat alone at feast days. But one morning as he traded barley at the market, a voice called his name. It was Sabine, also widowed. They had known each other as youths. She offered him a basket of plums. He offered her a coat for her son. No, promises were made. But that winter, Sabine's light appeared often in Henri's window. By spring, the village smiled when they walked together. And by midsummer, they were wed. Gently, simply, quietly. Their love was not like first love. It did not bloom with fire. It settled like moss, slow, steady, soft. Remarriage was not without judgment. Some whispered that a widow moved on too soon, that a widower forgot his vows. That second love could never be true love. But those who had loved and lost knew better. Second love did not erase the first. It built beside it, not as a replacement, but as a companion to memory. There were homes where 2 portraits hung above the hearth, one of a lost wife, one of the woman who now stirred the soup. The children did not forget, nor did the husband, but they smiled just the same when she sang, because love, when given the chance, grows again. Even the church, though cautious, recognized this. Priests preached about Ruth and Boaz, a widow who found grace again. They spoke of Saint Elizabeth, who remarried and still lived in virtue. They reminded the faithful, grief is sacred, but joy is not betrayal. Among the peasants, remarriage was often celebrated. A second wedding might be smaller but no less heartfelt. Neighbors brought bread, children ran through the fields, and the new couple, wiser than before, stood quietly at the church door, not as strangers, but as survivors. For those who never remarried, love still lingered. A man might live 20 years after his wife, but keep her comb beside the bed. A woman might never take another husband, but still sing his favorite harvest song. Their lives continued, but love left fingerprints everywhere. And sometimes it was not death that brought second chances, but mistakes. A couple separated by time, anger, or distance might find each other again in old age. Perhaps they met at their grandchild's christening. Perhaps they sat across from one another at a village feast and suddenly remembered the way things once were. And perhaps they spoke. And perhaps they forgave. And love, dusty and dented, came home again. So let us not speak only of first love. Let us speak also of the love that returns after storm, the love that tiptoes in after loss, the love that is quiet, scarred, tender, and but strong, because sometimes the second bloom is deeper than the first. It knows winter, it has tasted silence, and still it chooses to grow. So tonight, if your heart carries a memory or a regret or a name spoken only in dreams, know this: love is not one chance. It is many. And even after goodbye, it sometimes whispers again. Not all love makes it into the records. Some loves leave no letters, no rings, no official vows. They do not appear in family trees or painted tapestries. They lived instead in glances, in shared bread, in hands brushed while passing a cup. These are the stories in the margins. In the great tomes of history, the chronicles of kings, the lists of noble marriages, the saints' lives, and battle songs, there is little space for the quiet heart. But if you look closely, in the frayed corners of a monk's journal, in the side notes of a manor ledger, in the footnotes of a confession. You'll find them. Let us begin with those who were never allowed to love publicly. Two women, living in a convent, who shared not just a room, but a life. Their letters to each other were filled with scripture, yes, but also with phrases like, "You are my morning prayer." Were they lovers? Were they sisters of the soul? The records do not say. But the feeling was there, clear as candlelight. Or, two men, scribes in a cathedral town who worked side by side for 20 years. They shared a small house with ivy on the wall. One cooked, the other planted herbs. When one died, the other paid for his burial in full and visited every week until his own death. No one called it marriage. But it was. In the Middle Ages, same-sex love was both known and feared. Church law condemned it, sometimes fiercely, but the human heart does not listen to laws so easily. And so these loves lived quietly, secretly, tenderly, and not just same-sex love, but love across boundaries of class, station, and speech. A lady and her handmaid, a merchant's son and the daughter of a laundress, a Jewish scholar and a Christian midwife, a Moorish guard and a Saxon boy. These were not the stories sung by troubadours, but they were real, and they were brave, because to love someone you were not supposed to love meant risk of shame, of punishment, of loss, but people loved anyway. In one case recorded in the margins of a Flemish merchant's account book, a servant named Gertrude is listed as receiving monthly gifts, ribbons, herbs, a silver pin. The gifts continued long after her master married another. When she died, he paid for her stone to read only, "Beloved." There are stories, too, of bonded companions, men and women who never married but lived together for decades. Perhaps they were cousins. Perhaps they were survivors. Perhaps they found in each other something gentler than passion. Comfort. One man, a shoemaker, left behind only one item when he died, a carved box containing a lock of hair and a note that said, "The one who sat beside me." No name, no explanation, but still, love. And what of those who loved from afar? The weaver who admired the miller's son but never spoke. The boy who walked the long way to church to glimpse the girl with the braid. The midwife who lit a candle for the priest who had once touched her wrist and apologized for doing so. These loves had no ending, but they mattered. Because not all love is meant to bloom. Some simply exists, like dew, brief, beautiful, unrecorded. And what of those who loved without ever being seen? The nurse who stayed beside a wounded knight for weeks, listening to him dream of someone else. The cook who packed a little extra bread into one soldier's satchel every time he passed through. The nun who cleaned the chapel every night and always paused a moment longer near the statue of a forgotten saint, because his face reminded her of someone long buried. These are not love stories with climaxes. They are not epics. They are fragments, echoes. But sometimes those echoes are what remain longest, because love, in its purest form, does not always ask for return. It does not always seek acknowledgement. Sometimes it simply gives. And so, the Middle Ages, though cloaked in formality, hierarchy, and law, was full of these quiet devotions, in ledger lines, in half-finished embroidery, in flowers laid beside gravestones at dawn. History did not write them down, but they happened. They happened in kitchens and cloisters, in stables and sick rooms, in silence. And they remind us that love is not always thunder. Sometimes it is a single candle, burning where no one is looking. So if your heart ever wonders whether it has loved enough or correctly or deservedly, remember, there were lovers who never spoke. There were hearts who gave and never received. And yet they too shaped the world, not with war or wealth, but with presence, with a look, a gesture, a prayer said for someone who would never know. And that was love too. What remains when love moves on? When the voices grow quiet, when the hands no longer reach, what is left behind. In the Middle Ages, as in every age, love left traces, not always in words but in things. Small, worn, simple objects, kept close, not for their worth but for their meaning. These were the keepsakes of the heart. Let us begin with the most enduring, the ring. To wear a ring upon the finger was to carry a promise, sometimes loud, often private. Not all couples in the medieval world exchanged rings, especially among the poor. But when they did, the ring was rarely ornate. A simple band of iron or bronze, or if fortune allowed, silver or gold. The circle meant eternity. No beginning, no end. A shape made for the joining of two lives. In some places, the ring was placed on the right hand. In others, the left. The finger varied too, but always, it symbolized a bond, not just before God and neighbors, but between two souls. Some rings were engraved, not with names, but with phrases. Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Or simply, Salvant me, remember me. And when love ended, by death, by distance, or by silence, the ring remained, worn still, or hidden in a drawer, or tied to a ribbon tucked beneath a tunic, because to lose someone did not mean to stop remembering. Beyond rings, there were tokens of affection exchanged like secrets, a handkerchief carefully embroidered, perhaps with initials no one else could decipher, a belt or girdle given by a woman to her chosen knight before battle, a lock of hair tied with thread and pressed into a wooden box. Hair in particular held power. It did not age. It did not decay easily. To hold a braid, a curl, was to hold time still, an image of a beloved that could not fade. There are stories of warriors who wore their lover's hair sewn into their cloak lining, never seen, but always near. Of widows who kept a single strand in a book of hours, folded like a prayer. Even among the poorest, love found expression in gifts: a carved spoon, a bird made of straw, a pebble painted with ochre and wrapped in cloth. These were not grand, but they were remembered. Children sometimes found such tokens years later, long after the giver was gone. They'd open a drawer or lift a stone and find a folded cloth, a ribbon, a letter written in a hand no longer living. And in that moment, they met a piece of their parents' love, not in stories, but in objects held and cherished. For noble families, the tokens grew more elaborate. Brooches shaped like doves or hearts, lockets containing miniature portraits, a lacework of gold worn only on feast days. Yet even then, it was not the wealth that mattered, but the meaning. A duchess might treasure a simple wooden cross given to her by a lover she was never allowed to marry. A count might keep a glove tucked in his saddlebag, kissed once and never again. Even books, rare and precious, became vessels of remembrance, margins filled with notes. He read this aloud to me, or she laughed here, dried petals pressed between pages. A ribbon used as a bookmark once tied in her hair, and beyond the physical, memory lived in places. A bench where hands had touched, a tree carved with initials, a footpath walked together in silence. These too became symbols, places one, returned to not with company but alone, with thoughts. Some widows and widowers made shrines, not grand but personal. A corner of a home kept just so, a cup never moved, a shawl left on its peg. To visitors, they were ordinary. To the heart, they were sacred. Even songs carried memory. A melody hummed at dusk, a line whispered during work. That was her favorite, one might say. And then fall silent. Because in the Middle Ages, as today, memory was a kind of love, and to remember was to keep loving. Some took memory even further. They commissioned prayers in the name of their beloved, gave coin to monasteries, asking monks to speak their name once a year, lit candles each feast day, wore mourning clothes not just for the custom but for comfort. Grief, when softened by ritual, became a devotion, and some, those who loved deeply and lost painfully, chose to never remarry, not out of law or lack, but loyalty. They wore their tokens like armor, and their homes became quiet museums of love once lived. But not all keepsakes were physical. Some were gestures, habits, words. A man might teach his son to tie a knot the way his wife once showed him. A woman might pause at the same window, each evening watching the road her husband once took. A prayer repeated not for salvation but for presence. These too are symbols, invisible but lasting. So we return to the question, what do we keep? Not just the ring, not just the cloth, but the feeling. The warmth left in the air, the weight in a folded note, the scent of rosemary pressed into an old glove. In the end, love in the Middle Ages, like love in any age, was not always loud or long or easy, but it was marked by things, by moments, by memory, and those marks, they remain. So tonight, if you carry a token, be it a ring, a ribbon, or simply a song in your chest, know this: you are part of that same story, of what is given, of what is kept, of what never truly leaves. The fire crackles low. Outside, the night stretches its arms across the hills. The sheep are silent. The wind plays gently through the trees. But inside a small, warm cottage, voices rise, not loudly, not urgently, but like smoke curling upward, into darkness. Someone is telling a story, and not just any story, but a tale of love. In the Middle Ages, long before books were common, long before many could read or write, stories were kept alive by voice. Around the hearth, after the bread was eaten and the tools set aside, families gathered, elders leaned forward, children listened wide-eyed. The storyteller began. And love was often at the heart of the tale. Some stories were romantic legends passed down through generations. Others were local, simple, personal, and half-true. But all of them helped shape how people thought about love, what it was, what it meant, what it could endure. Let us begin with the great ones, Tristan and Isolde, a knight and an Irish princess bound by a potion and doomed by fate. Their love was reckless, forbidden, and deeply poetic. In one version, they die in each other's arms. In another, they are buried side by side, and two trees grow from their graves, intertwining above the earth. It was not a tale told for moral instruction. It was told for feeling, for longing, for the way it stirred something deep in the chest, even among those who had never known such passion. Then came Lancelot and Guinevere, the knight of unmatched honor and the queen of a great king. Their love, too, was forbidden, and yet it was told and retold, sung by troubadours, whispered in the corners of feast halls, because it asked a question that still echoes: can one love truly and still betray? Stories like these weren't just entertainment. They were emotional maps. Listeners recognized parts of themselves, the longing, the guilt, the thrill, the ache. And in those moments, love became shared. Not every tale was grand. In small villages, people told stories of a girl who married a shepherd she met during Lent, or a boy who built a boat to visit the miller's daughter across the river. There were tales of ghosts who visited their lovers, of a knight who carved a song into a tree, of a baker who baked a different loaf each week, hoping someone would notice. These weren't meant to teach. They were meant to comfort, because storytelling was in many ways a form of healing. When someone lost a spouse, they told a story. When someone waited for a letter that never came, they told a story. When someone dared to hope again after a bitter winter, they told a story. It made the impossible feel possible. It gave the heart a voice when the mouth could not speak. And then there were songs, softly plucked on a lute, whistled while tending the goats, sung by a mother to her child, who didn't yet know what the words meant. These songs were sometimes rhymed, sometimes not. Many were passed from one singer to the next, reshaped along the way, but they almost always returned to love. Love across distance, Love across death. Love that was never spoken, only sung. One such song, common in the French countryside, told of a girl who wore 7 blue ribbons, each one given to her by a different admirer. But she gave them all away, except the last, which she tied to the tree where she waited each spring. No one knew why. Another from England spoke of a sailor who returned from war only to find his beloved married to another. Rather than fight or flee, he left a single rose at her gate each year on Midsummer's Eve. These were not stories of triumph. They were stories of quiet devotion, of love not needing victory to be real. And who told these tales? Everyone. The grandmother, by the fire, her voice thin but steady. The village priest weaving morality into fables. The traveling bard, exchanging music for soup. Even children who repeated tales they only half understood, because storytelling was survival. In a world where so much was uncertain, crops, wars, sickness, stories gave structure, a beginning, a middle, an end. And within them, love often stood as the steady center. Even monks wrote parables of love, though cloaked in saints and symbolism. A soul longing for God described in the language of a lover. A hermit who heard angels not in songs but in the sighs of the forest, each one a memory of a love he once knew. Sometimes love lived in legends of miracles. A woman who prayed to Saint Agnes and was reunited with a lost fiancé. A knight who vowed chastity until his beloved returned from pilgrimage and whose shield never cracked in battle. These stories weren't always believed, but they were cherished. And in them, people found something not always present in daily life: hope. Because love in reality was often messy. It didn't always look like the stories. It was quieter, harder. But through stories, love was reminded of what it could be, even when it was gone. So picture this. A family sits around a fire. A young boy leans against his mother's knee. The old uncle clears his throat and begins. Once, there was a girl who fell in love with a boy who sang to the stars. And outside, the wind hushes to listen. Because in that moment, love lives again. Not in the body, not in the hand, but in the telling. And perhaps that is love's greatest gift, that even when it passes, it is never quite gone. Not all love speaks in words. Sometimes it whispers in flavor. Sometimes it lingers in scent. Sometimes it's the warmth of a bowl of stew, or the softness of linen just changed. In the Middle Ages, where life was often practical and restrained, romance lived not only in poetry or song, but in the quiet realm of the senses. Where a touch was rare, a scent lingered longer. Where words were few, food became a language all its own. Let us begin with taste. Imagine a couple in a small cottage, newly married, still learning each other's names in the dark. He rises early to chop wood. She stirs the pot with herbs. Their lives are hard, but there are moments in the kitchen where something softer simmers, a dash of cinnamon saved for feast days, a drizzle of honey on barley bread, a fig split between fingers and passed to a waiting mouth. Food was affection. To prepare a dish for someone was to show care. To season it well was to offer pleasure. A good cook, man or woman, was often loved as much for their skill as for their company. In noble courts, this sensory language grew more elaborate. Banquets became stages for flirtation. A lady might pass a favored knight a sugared almond. A troubadour might compare his beloved's lips to the sweetness of quince jam. Recipes included rosewater, ginger, cloves, ingredients thought to warm the body and stir the heart. One medieval herbal text claimed nutmeg was most pleasing to lovers, and cinnamon brings gladness of spirit. Whether it was true or not, it gave cooks a secret smile. But even in peasant homes, the idea persisted. To feed was to love. To nourish was to invite closeness. To share was to connect. Beyond taste came scent. In an age without soaps as we know them, fragrance was prized, not just to mask but to express. Herbs were dried and sewn into sachets. Lavender for calm, rosemary for remembrance, sage for protection. Lovers exchanged scented cloths, handkerchiefs perfumed with crushed violets, or girdles rubbed with balm. A knight might carry one into battle. A bride might sleep with one beneath her pillow. The scent became memory, and memory became longing. Some women wore garlands of dried petals in their hair. Others bathed, rarely, but purposefully, before feast days or weddings, using waters infused with mint and thyme. One story tells of a farmer's daughter who wore only one perfume in her life, basil steeped in oil, and how her husband, old and blind, still recognized her by that scent 50 years later. For those of higher class, perfumed oils were imported from the East. Musk, ambergris, rose attar. These were luxuries, but deeply desired. They symbolized allure, sophistication, and sensual power, but it wasn't always about the exotic. Sometimes the most powerful scent was bread baking, or linen dried in the sun, or the smoke of applewood in someone's hair. These smells, simple and constant, became the true signatures of love. Not rare, but remembered. Then came touch, perhaps the most guarded sense of all. In medieval society, physical contact between men and women, especially unmarried ones, was limited. But that very scarcity made touch precious. A hand brushing, another during a meal. A shoulder leaned against for just a moment too long. Fingers that met beneath a shared blanket in winter. These were not bold gestures. They were acts of trust. And within marriage, where touch was permitted, it became a way not just of intimacy, but of reassurance. To stroke someone's hair after a long day, to rub balm into aching feet, to lace up a back without pulling too tight. In noble courts, lovers might touch through the dance, elaborate, careful, choreographed, but still rich with subtext. A touch of fingertips during a spin. A palm rested too long upon another's. Even the act of clothing someone, tying their corset, buckling their belt, was often laced with quiet affection. Because to be close was to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable was to love. All of these senses, taste, scent, touch, wove together into what we now call sensuality. But in the Middle Ages, it was less about seduction and more about connection. A woman making broth for a husband who had returned wet from the fields. A man braiding his wife's hair as she nursed their child. A whispered joke while feeding goats. These were the moments where love grew, not in passion, but in presence. And yet, even passion had its place. Certain foods were believed to stir desire. Almonds, pepper, onions, honeyed wine. Couples would sometimes share such meals before the wedding night. Not openly, but with quiet understanding. Some poems speak of fruit shared between lips, of wines that made the cheeks glow, of sweet cakes eaten in bed. But these were rarities. For most sensual love was not fire, it was warmth. Not overwhelming, just enough to soften the bones after a cold day. So tonight, picture this. A woman brings her husband a bowl of soup, scented with sage. He takes it in his rough hands and smiles. She sits beside him, their knees just touching. No words, just steam and scent and shared breath. And that, more than any song or speech, is love. It is spices and sighs. It is flavor and feeling. It is caring through the senses when words are few. Because love, in the end, lives not just in the heart, but in the hands that cook, the herbs that heal, and the skin that remembers. As twilight fell across the medieval world and church bells rang softly in the distance, people told stories not only to remember, but to believe. Belief in a love greater than themselves. Belief that the heart could triumph where swords could not. Belief that miracles, however quiet, were possible. In these stories, love became legend. Let us begin with the saints. The church, ever cautious about romance, nonetheless gave space for sacred affection, love refined by faith, often tested by hardship. And sometimes, within these lives of devotion and martyrdom, a different kind of love flickered. There is the story of Saint Valentine, not just one man, but possibly several, whose feast day became synonymous with love. One version tells of a Roman priest who defied imperial orders and performed secret marriages for soldiers. Captured, imprisoned, and sentenced to death, he was said to have fallen in love with his jailer's daughter. On the eve of his execution, he wrote her a letter signed, "From your Valentine." Fact or embellishment, the tale lived on, because the heart wanted to believe that even in dungeons, love could bloom. Other saints' stories held subtler notes of romance. Saint Dwynwen, the Welsh patroness of lovers, once loved a man she could not marry. Heartbroken, she prayed to forget him, and was granted that wish. But instead of bitterness, she chose compassion, dedicating her life to helping others find love. Pilgrims still visit her well in Anglesey, dropping pins into the water and watching them swirl, seeking answers to unspoken questions. These were not tales of romantic fulfillment. They were tales of sacrifice, memory, and hope. But outside the hallowed walls of the church, love took on even stranger shapes. In the legends of medieval Europe, love became magic. A knight would fall asleep under a tree and dream of a lady he'd never met. She'd appear each night in vision until he set off across mountains to find her. When he did, she would vanish, leaving behind only a glove, still warm. Or the tale of a farmer's son who saved a swan with an arrow wound, only to wake the next morning to find a beautiful maiden at his hearth. She cooked for him, sang, and then just as quietly turned back into feathers and disappeared. People believed that true love could break curses, that a faithful kiss could wake the enchanted, that a promise made under moonlight might bind two souls beyond the grave. There were tales of lovers turned into trees, growing side by side, their branches entwined. Of rivers said to weep when separated lovers stood upon opposite banks. Of candles that would not extinguish until the beloved returned home safely. These legends were passed by word of mouth, embroidered into tapestries, scratched into chapel walls. But why did they matter? Because in a world ruled by war, plague, and hard seasons, they gave meaning. If lovers died young, perhaps they became stars. If a promise was broken, perhaps a rose would wither every spring in remembrance. If two people could not be together in life, perhaps they met each other. In dreams, myths made grief bearable. They made love feel eternal. And sometimes the church embraced these stories too. Holy relics were believed to carry the power of love. A splinter from the staff of Joseph. A veil said to belong to Mary Magdalene. Lovers would pilgrimage to these relics, praying for blessings, not just of fertility, but of understanding, forgiveness, reunion. One tale tells of a couple who had quarreled so bitterly, they vowed never to speak again. But after visiting a shrine together, they returned home in silence, only to wake one night holding hands. They never knew who moved first. Such miracles were not official, but they were shared, because every village had a story. A couple who survived the plague because they never slept apart. A woman who waited 10 years at the same river bend until her beloved returned. A man who carved the same name into every door he passed for 30 winters. Were they true? Perhaps not. But truth was never the point. The point was that love, even when lost, could leave a trail of light. And that sometimes if you followed that trail, you found something waiting. Even the stars told stories. In medieval astronomy, constellations were named not just for gods, but for lovers. Andromeda and Perseus, Orpheus and Eurydice, Tristan and Isolde forever fleeing across the sky. Shepherds pointed to those stars and whispered their meanings. Sailors made vows beneath them. Young girls watched them, clutching tokens in hand, wondering if they were being watched in return. Love became a cosmic truth, part of the very firmament, and perhaps that is what all these legends sought to teach. That love was not just between two people. It was part of the world itself. In stone and stream, in the wind and the wax of candles, in the way two trees lean toward each other in winter. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close and the firelight fades behind your lids, imagine chapel on a hill, a woman lighting a candle, a man waiting by a tree. Neither speaks, but they've met before, here or in a story, or perhaps only in the heart. And still, They wait. Because love, when turned to legend, never quite ends. Lives in the hush between verses, in the silence before dawn, in the soft space where hope still breathes. Not every heart finds another. Not every door is knocked upon. Not every longing ends in a touch. In the Middle Ages, as in every age, there were those who waited, and waited, and waited still. And for them, the story did not end in wedding, bells, or shared hearths. It ended in silence, or rather, it continued, in a different kind of love. Let us speak tonight of the love that never came. The young woman who watched every road bend in spring, hoping. The old shepherd who carved a name into his staff, though he'd never spoken it aloud. The merchant's daughter who once danced with a pilgrim and never danced again. These are not tales of heartbreak. They are stories of quietness, of longing lived with grace. In a world that praised union, those who remained alone were often seen as unfinished, a spinster, a bachelor, a soul still waiting. But often they were more complete than we imagined. Solitude in the Middle Ages could be chosen, or simply arrived by way of fate. A woman whose betrothed died in war might never marry. A man who loved beyond his class, his faith or his reach might step aside in silence. A peasant too poor, a nun too devoted, a boy too shy. All of them might grow old with no one ever calling their name in affection. And yet, they lived. They baked bread. They sang to animals. They planted herbs by the window. They watched others fall in love, raise children, grow old in pairs, and still they smiled. Because love, while longed for, was not the only song they knew. For some, waiting became a kind of ritual. Each midsummer, a woman might walk to the edge of the woods, not in grief, but in memory. She would stand beneath the same tree, touch its bark, and whisper a name no one else remembered. Was it someone real? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was just a dream she'd once had. A boy with green eyes, a voice like flutes in fog, a hand never quite held. Some people built whole worlds around the idea of a love they never met. They imagined what he would say, how she would laugh, how they'd sit in the corner of the cottage, shelling peas side by side. These dreams did not make them foolish. They made them human, because the heart, even when unanswered, does not stop speaking. It whispers. It writes poetry and thought. It sets places at tables for those who never arrive. There is a story, half legend, half memory, of a woman in the hills of Brittany who wore the same blue shawl every Sunday for 60 years. No one knew why. She never married, but she would sit at the back of the church, fingers folded, eyes closed. When she died, her belongings were simple: a prayer book, a sprig of lavender, and a sealed letter. The letter had no name, only the words, "If you ever come back." No one knows if it was ever sent, but perhaps that's the point. Waiting is not always about outcome. It is about space, about leaving room for something sacred, even if that something never steps through the door. In convents, monks and nuns took vows of chastity, but that did not mean they never knew longing. Many wrote about it, not as torment, but as transformation. The desire for closeness was reshaped into closeness with the divine, or with beauty, or simply with quiet understanding of others. A nun might tend roses not because someone loved her, but because she had love to give. A monk might write poems not for a person, but for the idea of tenderness. Their solitude was not emptiness. It was devotion in another form. And then there were those who did not wait, but who simply accepted. A farmer who never found a wife, but became beloved by every child in the village. A widow who never remarried, but taught all the girls how to sew. An apprentice who lived alone, but wrote letters to everyone else's birthdays. They filled their lives not with what was missing, but with what was present. And in doing so, they gave us a different definition of love. Love, not as possession, not as storybook conclusion, but as presence, as attention, as care, given freely. Because sometimes the most faithful hearts are those that never belong to anyone else. And yet, they loved the world deeply. So let us not forget them, the ones who never heard I love you, but still said it with soup, the ones who never kissed a lover's mouth, but still knew how to comfort a crying friend, the ones who lit candles not in pairs but alone and made it enough. Their dreams were not lesser, their stories were not lacking, they were simply quiet, and perhaps in that quiet was the purest kind of love, unclaimed, unnamed, but still deeply real. So tonight, if your arms feel empty, if your bed is cool, if your name has not yet been called, know this: you are not alone. You are not unfinished. You are not unloved. You are waiting, perhaps. But even in that waiting, you are whole. Some loves are written in letters, others are whispered in songs, but many, perhaps most, are spoken through labor. In the Middle Ages, love was rarely declared with words. Few had the time, fewer still the luxury. But love made itself known, quietly, steadily through service, sacrifice, and the long, slow rhythm of shared work. Let us begin in a field. The sun is rising, casting gold over furrowed earth. A man lifts his scythe, shoulders aching, and begins to cut. Nearby, his wife stoops low, gathering what falls. They speak little. The work is too heavy, the air too warm. But every once in a while, she glances his way, and he, sensing her gaze, stands straighter. They do not touch. They do not smile. But they are together. And this, in the medieval world, was often the truest form of love. Co-labor. To share labor was to share life. To toil side by side was to know one another deeply, not through speech but through sweat. In peasant households, husbands and wives worked together from dawn to dusk. She milked the goats while he mended the fence. He fetched water while she turned grain into dough. Children ran between them, learning by watching. They did not speak of love. They lived it. A wife who patched a husband's cloak, not because he asked, but because she saw the tear. A husband who let her sleep an hour longer after a rough night with the baby. A boy who stayed in the fields longer so his sister could finish weaving in peace. These were not grand gestures. They were daily devotions. And devotion, in the medieval world, was love made practical. Even among the nobility, where hands did less work, love through service existed. A lord might ride out early to inspect the orchard, not because he cared for apples, but because his wife mentioned she missed their taste. A lady might stay up late sewing a new cloak for her aging husband, pretending it was simply for ceremony. They too had their quiet tasks, because even in silk, love can be sewn one stitch at a time. Then there were those whose love took the shape of sacrifice. A daughter who refused marriage to stay and care for her widowed mother. A squire who followed his knight not for glory, but because he loved him in silence. A nun who fasted and prayed for the soul of a man she could never touch. Love often required giving something up. Comfort, recognition, freedom. But in giving, many felt fuller, not emptier. There's a tale from a monastery in the Alps of a lay brother named Alain, who worked in the kitchen. He never spoke during meals, rarely looked anyone in the eye, but he always remembered which monk liked his bread crisp, which one needed softer broth, who hated turnips. For 30 years, he served without thanks. Only when he died did the monks find a journal in his room, filled not with scripture but with small notes. Brother Thomas had a bad dream. I added honey to his tea. Abbot coughed this morning, more garlic in his stew. Brother Lucas looked tired. I smiled at him. He smiled back. He had loved them, all of them, through work. In another village, an old woman named Marta made herbal remedies. She lived alone, never married. But every illness in town passed through her door. She remembered every child's birthday, every widow's sorrow, every young man's first heartbreak. She called none of it love, but everyone else did. Because service, freely given, is a kind of romance. It asks for nothing and gives everything. Even in sickness, love served. A wife bathing, her husband's blistered feet after war. A husband brushing his wife's hair gently when her hands could no longer move. A friend holding vigil through the night, changing cloth, cooling fever, never asking why. In the medieval imagination, these acts were sacred. The church taught that Christ washed the feet of his disciples, that saints carried the wounds of others. That love, true love, was never idle. Even romantic love was judged not by desire but by willingness to serve. Would you sacrifice sleep for them? Would you walk 10 miles to find the herb they needed? Would you carry water on cold mornings just so they didn't have to? If yes, then you loved. Because in a world without greeting cards or weekend getaways, love had to be practical. A candle, lit before they woke. Their favorite song hummed during laundry. A loaf of bread made thinner so they could have the last plum. And what about shared work? There is something deeply intimate in building something together. A table, worn smooth, by 2 sets of hands. A garden tilled by lovers who argued and laughed through planting. A roof repaired before the first frost, with that one shingle always slightly crooked and always the favorite. Shared labor did not always go smoothly. There were quarrels, frustration, tiredness, but to keep showing up, day after day, was love. Even when voices grew harsh, even when arms ached, even when no one said thank you. Because beneath the labor was loyalty, and beneath loyalty, affection. So tonight, as you lie still and think of all the unseen things done for you, or all the things you've done for others, know this: each bowl washed, each coat mended, each cup filled without being asked, was a love letter, not written in ink, but in action. And those, in the end, are the ones that last. In the medieval world, the passage of time was marked not by clocks, but by the turning of the seasons. Each season brought its own rhythms, labors, and celebrations. And for love, too, the seasons held their sway, shaping courtships, marriages, and the quiet longing of hearts. Let us journey through the year, exploring how love unfolded from spring's first bloom to winter's hush. Spring. The awakening. Spring was the season of beginnings. As the earth stirred from its slumber, so did the hearts of men and women. Budding flowers and lengthening days mirrored the blossoming of new affections. In villages, festivals like May Day celebrated fertility and renewal. Young couples danced around the maypole, weaving ribbons in patterns as intricate as their budding romances. It was a time for flirtation, for stolen glances, for the hope that this year, perhaps, love would come. Poets and troubadours often likened love to spring's freshness. In the words of one medieval lyric, "As the rose unfolds in morning light, so does my heart at her sweet sight." Spring's love was tender, full of promise, yet untested. Summer, the passion. With summer came the fullness of life and of love. Fields ripened under the sun, and so did relationships. Courtships that began in spring often deepened, moving from shy smiles to shared commitments. Summer weddings were common, celebrated with feasts and dancing. The warmth of the season allowed for outdoor gatherings where communities came together to witness unions. In literature, summer symbolized passion. Lovers met in shaded groves, their affections as intense as the midday heat. Yet, just as summer storms could be sudden and fierce, so too could the quarrels of passionate hearts. Still, summer's love was vibrant, alive with the energy of youth and the belief in endless days. Autumn. The reflection as leaves turned gold and fell. Love took on a different hue. Autumn was a time of reflection, of assessing what had been sown and what had been lost. For some, it was a season of contentment. Couples who had weathered the trials of earlier months found comfort in shared routines and mutual understanding. Their love was quieter, but deeper, like the rich colors of the harvest. For others, autumn brought melancholy, unfulfilled promises, lost loves, or the realization that time was passing could weigh heavily. Yet even in sorrow, there was beauty. A medieval ballad tells of a knight who, returning from war too late to claim his beloved, plants a tree by her grave. Each autumn its leaves fall like tears, a testament to enduring love. Autumn's love was mature, tinged with both gratitude and wistfulness. Winter. The enduring winter, with its cold and darkness, might seem an unlikely season for love. Yet, in the medieval imagination, it held a special place. In the hearth's glow, families gathered, sharing stories and warmth. Elderly couples, their hands worn by time, sat side by side, embodying a love that had endured many seasons. For those alone, winter was a time of introspection. Monks and nuns devoted to spiritual love found solace in the stillness. Their writings speak of a divine affection, as constant as the northern star. Winter's love was steadfast. Stripped of youthful fervor, it revealed the core of commitment. Love that, like evergreen trees, remained through life's harshest trials. The cycle continues in medieval thought. The seasons were not just a backdrop, but a metaphor for life's stages. Spring represented youth, summer adulthood, autumn maturity, and winter old age. Love, too, followed this cycle. From the first stirrings of attraction to the deep bonds of lifelong partnership, each phase had its season. And just as the year turned, anew each spring, so did love find ways to begin again. Widows remarried, young hearts healed, and the dance of affection continued. In the words of a medieval proverb, though leaves may fall and rivers freeze, love returns with budding trees. So, as you rest tonight, consider the season of your own heart. Whether you're in the bloom of spring or the quiet of winter, know that each phase holds its own beauty, its own lessons, and its own kind of love. They say the air turned still before the sickness arrived. The birds grew quiet, the bells stopped, and behind shuttered windows lovers held their breath, not for romance, but for survival. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe with a cruelty that left little untouched. Towns emptied, villages fell silent. The rhythm of life, planting, gathering, feasting, singing, shattered. And yet, love remained. Perhaps not as it had been. Perhaps not with courtship or carols. But in new shapes, forged in fear and shadow, love still lived. Let us walk slowly through those darkened streets. Let us listen to how the heart spoke when the mouth could not. Let us see how affection endured, not in spite of plague, but inside it. A new kind of courtship. In the time of plague, closeness became danger, touch became risk, and yet, those who longed still found ways to say, I see you, I wait for you, I love you. In some towns, young people would stand at either end of a narrow alleyway, speaking softly across the stones, never daring to meet. They'd bring gifts, not flowers, but cloth, garlic, or dried herbs. They'd carve their initials into beams they could not touch. Some left notes at thresholds wrapped in oiled paper, weighted with pebbles. Others tied ribbons to trees in churchyards, coded colors, known only to the recipient, because the body could not approach. But the heart still leaned forward, letters and distance. When travel became dangerous and many were confined to monasteries or manors, letters became lifelines. Lovers wrote longhand by candlelight, pressing their hopes into paper. They used perfumed wax seals, dried petals between pages, prayers tucked into the folds. Some letters arrived too late. Others were read so many times the ink wore thin. One surviving note from a merchant in Rouen to his betrothed simply says, I am not ill. My love endures. And that was enough. Because even when the body was far, love tried to stay near. Devotion at the bedside. Where the plague struck, it struck swiftly. Families watched as loved ones collapsed in hours. To care for the sick was to risk death. And yet many did. Wives bathed husbands in rosemary water, hoping to ease their burning skin. Sons sat beside mothers, hands wrapped in cloth, just to be near them one last time. There are records of priests and nuns who refused to flee, choosing, instead, to stay with the afflicted. Not just out of duty, but because they loved. Love for community. Love for the unseen soul. One tale from Italy tells of a woman who sang each night to her ill husband through the thin wall that separated them. She did not touch him. but her song was his comfort. He died in silence, but she sang again the next night, for memory. Love, it seems, does not need a body to hold. The mourning that never ended. After the worst waves passed, entire towns had changed. Graves outnumbered homes. Many lovers never reunited. Some disappeared, their names recorded only as absent. But love mourned them. Women wore black not for months, but years. Men carved their beloved's names into walking staffs or doorway, lintels. Some never remarried, not from law, but from loyalty. A baker in France baked a single sweetbread each St. Martin's Day for the girl he courted who vanished before their wedding. He lived to be 70. He never missed a year. Such rituals were not for ghosts. They were for the living, who still needed to love someone who was no longer there. Unexpected unions, but not all stories end in silence. In the ruins of plague-struck cities, people began again. Some who had never spoken before now found themselves the only two left on a street. And they looked at each other and did not look away. Love, unexpected, bloomed amidst the ashes. A young widow and a traveling priest turned shepherd. Two apprentices who had worked side by side for years and never thought to kiss. A girl who nursed her sister's best friend and stayed. These were not storybook loves. They were loves born of scarcity, of need, of shared pain. But they were real, and they endured. The faith that love would return, and finally, there were those who waited, who lit a candle each night not knowing if their beloved lived, who wore the same pendant day after day, who whispered names into wind, who never stopped looking at the road. Not all found what they sought, but many believed, truly believed, that love, like spring, would return. Because in the deepest parts of plague time, something became clear. Love is not always joy. Sometimes it is labor, sometimes it is loss. But always it is a choice to keep holding on, to memory, to hope, to someone who might still walk through the gate tomorrow. So tonight let us light a candle in our hearts for those who loved through the dark, for the hand that could not touch, for the voice that sang through walls, for the letter carried, too late, and for the quiet truth they all knew, that even when the world breaks, love bends, but does not break. The world did not end when the bell stopped ringing. The candles were relit, the fields replanted, the windows opened once more, and somewhere quietly, without ceremony, love returned. It did not come as a trumpet. It did not knock on every door. It did not erase the grief that had come before. But it did come, and when it came, it looked a little different. Where once there had been roses and songs, now there was eye contact across the market square. Now there was a loaf of bread left quietly, at someone's doorstep. Now there was the offer of a coat when winter arrived too soon. These were not grand declarations. They were gestures of trust reborn, because after loss, love does not return with fanfare. It returns with gentleness. Let us walk again through the towns and villages of the post-plague world. Here the walls still bear scars, but they are patched. The streets are swept. Life has begun its slow rhythm again. And at the heart of it, people are remembering how to love. Learning to love again. For those who had known love before the loss, loving again was both terrifying and sacred. Some never tried. They planted their memories like seeds and tended them carefully. But many, after years of silence, felt a stirring. A widower who spoke to the woman who mended his fence. A young woman who once vowed never to love again, now catching herself humming as she baked. A monk who once wrote only prayers, now composing letters to a woman who taught herbs on the edge of town. It was not that they forgot. It was that they remembered and chose to live anyway, children of the new spring. And then there were the children, those born after the silence, who never knew the world before. To them, love was not something to be feared. It was stories their parents whispered, songs sung on chilly mornings the way one person reached for another's hand as they walked. They watched those who survived and they learned that loving was an act of courage. That to choose someone was also to choose uncertainty and still say yes. These children grew with fewer illusions but greater depth. They did not expect love to last forever, but they expected it to be real. Art and storytelling as healing with time. The world began to speak again. Troubadours returned, their songs softer now, their words wiser. Tapestries were woven not just of battles and saints, but of domestic scenes. Two people laughing over soup, a child chasing a hen, lovers embracing beneath a rain cloud. Stories shifted too. The heroes were not always young or flawless. The heroines, not always saved. Sometimes the story was about two people who met late in life and found peace. Sometimes it was about a widow who never remarried but found love in raising her neighbor's children. These were not tales of passion. They were tales of resilience. And the audience, having lived through darkness, understood them deeply. The rituals of reconnection. After any great loss, we build rituals. And so too did those in the aftermath of plague. A second candle lit each night, not for the dead, but for the living. A flower planted each spring in someone's name. A day of silence, once a year, followed by a feast. These rituals were not meant to forget. They were meant to honor what was lost, while making room for what might still come. Redefining love in this new age was not defined by perfection. It was defined by presence. Were you there when I needed you? Did you hold my hand when no one else dared? Did you remember my favorite bread when the harvest was thin? These were the new questions. People still wrote poems. But now, they were less about stars and more about mornings. She brings me water before I wake. She does not know I hear her steps, but I do, and I love her. The silence between, in the spaces where love had been lost, silence remained. But even this, silence began to shift. It no longer echoed with sorrow alone. It began to hum softly with remembrance. A love that had once existed still left traces. In the way someone tilted their head, in the food they cooked, in the dreams they dreamed, and those who came next accepted these echoes. They did not ask for comparison. They simply said, I see you, as you are, as you were, as you're becoming. Hope woven into ordinary days, and perhaps that is how love rebirthed itself, not as fire, but as ember, not as storm, but as breeze. A man pausing on his way home to gather wildflowers. A woman warming soup just a little longer, knowing who it's for. Small things, but love has always lived in small things. And in this new age, love was no longer something to chase. It was something to nurture, to notice, to keep close, even if it changed, even if it went quiet, even if it came back in a different shape. So tonight, as the story closes, know this: love does not end. It fades, it weeps, it hides beneath snow and stone, but it waits, and when the world is ready, when hearts have rested, it rises, not to erase what came before, but to add to it, to say, yes, there was loss, but there is still breath. There is still morning. There is still you, and where there is you, there is always love.